Hi there! In need of a quick wire wrap pendant? Well, how about this? In under an hour you can create this gorgeous delicate pendant. So quick, let's get wrapping. In this project we're using 1mm diameter copper wire, which is 18 gauge, 0.25mm diameter copper wire, which is 30 gauge, a pear or flat drop shaped bead and a Jumpring. I'm using the 0.25mm diameter copper wire because I need it to fit through the bead twice. You can use a thicker wire for the weaving, but just check that it will go through that bead 2 times. And the tools we need are chain or flat nose pliers, round nose pliers, wire cutters, and then optionally bell making pliers and a file. For the frame we need 2 pieces of the 1mm diameter or 18 gauge wire, 10 cm or 4 inches long. We won't quite need all of this length, but it does make it a little easier to work with. So we'll take the first wire and we want to make a large loop in the centre. You can do this by hand, but I'm just going to use the second largest step on my bell making pliers, which just helps in making that shape. And as we cross the wires over, I'm using the pliers really just to hold that wire. Now we can check that loop against the stone that we've got. And mine's about the same size as the drop bead, but you could make it larger or smaller if you wanted to. Where those wires cross, I want the shape to match the top of the bead. And then we can just curve those wires back down a little bit, so they're following the sides of the drop bead. Down to where the hole is in the bead. Then I want those wires to come over the front of the bead. So I just measure where I want them to start curving round, and using my round nose pliers, make a curve in the end of one of the wires. And then need to match that the other side. And I'm just making those level, judging by eye. Then I'll curve the ends around a little bit more, just to create some pleasing curves on the front of the bead. Now we can check that against the bead. I think they might be a little bit low at the moment. So I can just go back in with my round nose pliers and adjust them to sit a little bit higher. Then I want to trim those wires so we have about half a loop. And I'll try to get them even. One is slightly longer than the other, so I'll trim that again. And I'm quite happy with where they're going to sit now. But of course what we've got now is a flush end on that wire, and because it will be sitting at the front of the pendant, I'm just going to file those a little bit, just so the top edge will be curved. Now it can be quite difficult to get access to these wires, so you can just bend them up a little bit just to help get that file in where you want it. And this is also easier using a bench pin, so I'll finish these off camera. And I've now got rounded top edges to those wires. I'll just check the shape again and adjust it, because the wires are likely to have moved whilst I was filing. And I'm quite happy with where that wire will be sitting, and it's worth at this point just moulding those wires so they'll sit over the front of the bead, just touching that bead nicely. We can adjust them a little bit more later, but it just helps to start getting them into position. So it's time to move on to the second wire. Now for this wire I want a small loop in the centre, so I'm going to use my round nose pliers for this. Just make sure I've centred that loop. And cross them over in the same direction as before. Now we want that loop to be fairly small, but still large enough to be able to wrap the weaving wire around. And we can check it against the first wire. And then mould those ends to the shape of the first wire. We're going to deal with the rest of this wire later on, so we can check that it sits into that first wire nicely, and we're ready to start weaving. We can use a closed jump ring in this project to hang the pendant from, like this little jump ring here. We just need to thread it onto the large loop before we start weaving. If you've got an open jump ring, you can of course add that to the finished pendant. I've estimated that this project will take about a metre of the 0.25 or 30 gauge wire, but I've got 120 centimetres here, which is 48 inches, just to be on the safe side. We want to put the two ends together to find the centre of that weaving wire. And then from that centre, we're going to wrap around the small loop. We just need to wrap the top half of this. But go carefully and make sure you're not overlapping those wraps. And we can just push those wraps together as we go to make sure they're nice and neat. Once we've wrapped the top half of that loop, we can fit this into the other frame piece. And wrap both of those wires 3 times. Then we're going to wrap just that outer wire 3 times. Then we'll do the same on the other side of the pendant with the other half of the weaving wire. Wrapping both wires 3 times. And then just the outer wire 3 times. Now what I'm calling the outer wire here turns into the inner wire once they cross. So it's the one with the short ends that we've curved round. Now that should be holding all of the wires together quite nicely. And we can just carefully clamp onto those double wires to help settle the wires a bit. And then we're going to continue weaving on each set of wires. Wrapping 3 times around both wires. And 3 times around the shorter wire. Up to where the 2 sets of wires cross. We'll do that on both sides. Then once we get to where the frame wires are crossing, we're going to swap the weaving wire over. So the one that was weaving the back 2 wires will come forward to weave the front wires, and vice versa. This will just help to hold those 2 sides together. Then we're going to continue that 3-3 weave from wherever we were where we crossed the wires, wrapping 3 times on the shorter wire and 3 times on both wires. And we'll continue this down both sides up to the point where the hole in the bead will be. Now the hole in my bead is fairly straight, but sometimes they are on a bit of an angle. And the good news with this project is that you can just weave down to where the hole starts on each side, even if that's slightly further down on one side than the other. And this will hold the bead nicely and straight in place. Now we're ready to add in the bead. And to do this, we're going to thread those weaving wires through in opposite directions, so they cross in the centre of the bead. Then we'll gently pull them through. And settle that bead into place. And once we've got it in position, we can pull those weaving wires to make sure they're nice and tight. And then we can continue the weave on both sides up to the point where we're weaving over both wires 3 times. We'll then finish the weave on the short wires, and we're just going to continue wrapping that longer wire to create a coil. And I want to wrap this a fair way, probably about 1.5 centimetres, maybe half an inch or so. Then we'll wrap the other side in the same way. The exact amount will depend on the size of your bead, and you can add more wraps a bit later if you need to. And before we shape those wires, we can check the ones on the front of the bead and carefully adjust them until they're sitting nicely on the front of that bead. I really want all of that wire to just be resting on the bead. Then we can turn the pendant over and carefully bend those long wire ends inwards. We can check the shape that we're making and just make sure they're even on both sides. And then continue bending those wires round until the ends are pointing upwards. We can go fairly carefully with this and just keep checking that they're in the position that we want. And I want those wire ends to be pointing vertically up the pendant and just meeting in the centre of the pendant. I'm quite happy with how that looks. So now we want to continue the coils on those 2 wires up to the point where they meet. It might just be useful to flick out the ends of those wires a bit. Just helps with access for that weaving wire. Now we've coiled around both of those curves up to where the frame wires meet in the middle. So we can just check that those wires are sitting where we want them. And then whichever of those weaving wire ends is the longest, we'll use to wrap both of those frame wires together. If your 2 weaving wires are the same length, then use either of them. And we're just going to wrap up to a few millimetres from the top of the bead. This will hold those frame wires together. Then we want to bend those frame wires outwards from the top of those wraps. And using our weaving wire, wrap a few times around one of those frame wires. I usually wrap this thin wire about 5 times, but you just need enough to hold it in place. And then we can trim off both of those weaving wires. And we just need to finish those frame wire ends. So we'll bend them forward so they're hugging the back of the bead. And then trim just below the top of the front weave. Then we can bend those wires forward a little bit more, so the ends butt up against that weave. And that leaves a nice finish that won't catch on anything. And our pendant is finished. If you're interested in more quick projects, head to this playlist, or check out this video which YouTube thinks you might like to see next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.